Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be talking about a different kind of currency that probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, but you should be. It's simply called slow money. That is the title of the book, Investing as a Food, Farms, and Fertility Mattered. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Woody Tasch. Woody, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how did you get started on this path of writing the book that you wrote here, Slow Money?
Oh, dear. It was a long, slow process. I'm not saying that to make a joke on the word slow, but I've been doing different versions of venture capital and social entrepreneurship and working with foundation investing for almost 30 years, and kept wondering why we weren't having more impact in various ways, and trying to kind of drill down, trying to get to some of the core issues. And several things happened along the way. I won't mention them all because it would take way too long, and everyone would fall asleep listening to it. But slow, and discovering slow food was part of it, and just feeling the power of that idea and movement, and thinking about how it would relate. The speed of money is such a fundamental. Perhaps one of the most fundamental issues, and then just a lifelong interest in agriculture, food and agriculture. So that's a partial answer.
Now, in your book, you talk about, for instance, how we're treating the earth, especially when it comes to growing and raising food. And I know that a lot of people are aware of what this problem is, but we seem to be very slow about, I suppose, changing our habits. Why do you think that is?
Oh, we're suffering from let's say, several generations of complacency, I guess, or false sense of security that came from the economic growth that started after World War II. And standards of living has gone up. Supermarket shelves are more full of things than ever before. Food is cheaper than it's ever been. I would say let's put a footnote by the healthcare cost thing. Food's gone down, healthcare costs have gone up. Some people think there's a pretty strong correlation there. But I would say, just in general, we've been swept up by the cultural developments of the last 50 years, which were, consumerism, suburbanization, globalization, all these things. They're very powerful forces, and we're not going to kind of turn it around in one, in a moment. It's going to take a little time to kind of slow down a little bit. Realize that there's another way. And the other way, by the way, I want to make clear, I'm not against all those things. I just meant it's just that we need balance, and we're way out of balance. We've kind of gone way to the extreme on those things, and it's time to kind of get things back some better relationship.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt about that, because you describe in your book that, farming, for instance, and it's giant industrial farming, is that here we are moving away from the natural way that things work into an unnatural way with fertilizers, pesticides. Now we've got genetically raised crops, for instance, corn and the like. And it seems that, that through the many years that we've been doing our program has a correlation to why, especially in America, people are sick. I mean, you've got 1 in 3 people getting diabetes. Cancer isn't just something that someone gets rarely once in a while, but it seems to be an epidemic, of crazy proportions. And you kind of got to figure out, where's all this coming from?
Yeah, I agree. I pretty much agree. I stop a little bit short of trying to assert, let's say, direct one-on-one causal relationships between this, that, and the other thing, because we could all debate those things forever. I think it's easier to get to consensus to just say we've gone way too far. The pendulum is just swinging. Common sense would tell us the pendulum is swinging way too far, and it's like, do you want your children growing up eating a diet exclusively of Twinkies and Captain Crunch? The answer is no. Do we want to ban Captain Crunch and Twinkies from the world? Probably not, because it's just way too complicated to think like that. I think it's better just to look at the extreme to which we've gone, and the categories you mentioned. Pesticide use, fertilizer use, soil erosion. There's a whole bunch of categories, aquifer depletion, toxics in the groundwater. There are so many different categories. If you look at each one of them, you'll see that the pendulum is just swinging way off the chart. And just common sense would say, we've just got to start balancing, otherwise something bad's going to happen. And I sometimes think, just to make the leap over to finance, because we're not just talking about slow food here, we're talking about slow money. I often think of the genetically modified crops as the derivatives of agriculture, meaning, we're very clever, we're coming up with all these really tricky ways to improve yields and this, that, and the other thing, but at some point the chickens are going to come home to roost. Our cleverness is, we're not going to trick Mother Nature forever just the way derivatives did not, let's say, trick, basic risk-return characteristics forever.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, it's interesting because I started thinking of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, and all of a sudden as I was reading your book, that came up, and I thought it was really interesting because really, in his book, Small is Beautiful, it's putting, I guess, the seller directly in front of the buyer, so to speak, and having a real relationship. And that's something that, especially in our food production, and that's just one area that I'm talking about here, that we tend to separate ourselves to where it's just a number, a nameless number, so to speak. And that's one of the areas that we need to start making changes, and that comes from personal, people who are actually the buyers, to start making better decisions about what they do and how they can be involved in that process.
Yeah, I didn't follow exactly how you made the connection back to Small is Beautiful, but I would just say yes. My book borrows heavily, or I should say is inspired heavily by Small is Beautiful. Mm-hmm. And, for those people who were old enough to be around when that book came out in the mid-'70s, I would say this is not a case of been there, done that. I mean, we were there, but we didn't do it. So now we got to do it. And so appreciating just the critical cultural, economic, and biological value of small, diversified, lots of small interactions, as opposed to this ever-consolidating, ever-speeding up thing we have called the economy. I mean, that's really a critical thing. And one of the really important parts of it is real relationships between people, so that the buyer and the seller know one another. Now, that sounds hokey in today's world, but a lot of the problems we have is all of these layers of intermediation. I mean, that's a direct causal thing of the meltdown in Wall Street, for sure, and that's an old story at this point. There were so many layers and so many pieces and so many players and so many hedges on everything that no one ended up knowing what the hell they owned anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's the most extreme version of it. The other end of the continuum, this is what's so beautiful about what we're doing, is very concrete. It's called a farmer's market or a CSA. Your direct connection with the person who grew your food. That's why farmers markets and CSAs are enjoying so much growth. People intuitively understand how important it is to have that direct connection.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know in your book you outlined, too, that with the growth of the farmers markets, it's still very small compared to where we really need to be to make this successful. Talk about some of the statistics on the one side and then going to the other side with the farmers markets.
Well, I'll just say, with all of the growth of organics, let's say, to take that one statistic, organic food has been growing at around 15% a year compounded for about 20 years now, and it's still just getting to about 3% of U.S. food sales. So even though it's been growing, quote, rapidly compared to the rest of the food industry, which is, experiencing very slow growth, I mean, there's only so many calories you can cram into the American body, And Michael Pollan talks, he really covers this beautifully. So I would say, organics has been growing, but still off of a tiny base. Same thing with farmers markets. Same thing with CSAs. In the last USDA, farm census that covered the period 2002 to 2007, small farms of less than 50 acres is the one category that had growth. And I can't remember. I think there was something like 33,000 new farms in that category. It was the first time since the Depression or something that number had gone up. So yeah, the numbers are kind of daunting if you want to look at, and you can do the same thing with socially responsible investing. I'm switching categories here, but they're kind of parallel. We're talking about small percentages of humongous structures, but I don't think that needs to be all that daunting because I think most people recognize that lasting change is going to happen from the grassroots. It's going to happen with lots of small people taking small steps. Wendell Berry, my favorite quote on this, is he talks about how soil is not lost in huge chunks. It's lost through millions of small acts of carelessness. And I'd like to see us as part of the response to that no, we want to start investing in a way that will inspire millions of small acts of care and restraint, using people's money to connect them back to these things.
Now, what's amazing, too, is that sometimes people take a look at the situation, and the first thing they'll point to is the large corporations making huge profits. You know, Monsanto can be one of these companies that somebody might bring up, and they think, you know, with such power and such size, it almost doesn't seem possible to do anything about the situation we're in. But as you've said, you know, it's an individual at a time. And to give people an idea of the impact, you mentioned somebody in here who had written a book called The Ecology of Commerce. Here was a guy that had an interesting business practice. If you could share with our listeners who this person was and what happened.
Well, Paul Hawken, I think Paul Hawken wrote a book called The Ecology of Commerce. His name is, let's say, you know, almost a household word in certain demographics, I guess you'd say, because of Smith and Hawken. But Paul's book, which he wrote in the mid-'90s, is truly a seminal work. It makes the case for what he called restorative economics, which I think is a beautiful term that we should be using a lot more than sustainability. You know, a little footnote on that. I mean, the punchline to that one is, it's already too late to sustain. We have to restore. We have to actually find ways to put value back in and repair some of the damage we've done. But Paul's book is a really powerful philosophical and economic, and with some poetry in there, not actual poetry, but let's say poetic use of language. It really evokes what an alternative vision of economics can be. And that book inspired a man named Ray Anderson, who read it, who was the founder and CEO of a public company called Interface, which is is a $1 billion carpeting company. And carpet, if anybody knows how carpet is traditionally made, it's one of the dirtiest. You know, it's really a dirty petrochemical intensive business. Ray Anderson was so inspired by that book that he vowed to turn his company into the first zero throughput, major industrial manufacturing company. And they're about 70% of the way there. That's been going on for about 15 years now. So I'm not sure if that's exactly the story you wanted, but it's a story of how...
Well, it is, because it's about a guy who had one particular way of doing business, which was making carpets that is extremely polluted, and just took a look at what he was doing and said, wait a minute, I think I need to change what I'm doing here.
Yeah, and so Paul inspired Ray and a lot of other people, but then Ray has now inspired a whole lot of other people. I mean, Ray Anderson is one of the most inspiring business leaders I've ever had the pleasure of meeting and listening to, and I've heard him do his thing, if you want to say his public talk now, maybe 5 different times in major public settings, in addition to having had a number of other interactions with him. But when I hear him speak, it still makes me cry every time I hear him speak. I mean, this is a Georgia Tech, trustee, an engineer by training, an industrial CEO who had an awakening. I think he was in his early 60s at the time of this awakening from Small is Beautiful, so he was well into his career by then. And I'm doing a very bad job of paraphrasing, by the way, so I just encourage listeners to check out Ray Anderson at Interface and watch some of his videos. But he basically realized from reading that book, he said, I have been plundering. I have been getting rich plundering and polluting, and I must stop. And he actually said it way stronger than I did just now, but it's better for you to hear it in his words. And then he set about changing his company, and the company's benefited from it. That's the beautiful sort of double or triple bottom line part of the story. The company has actually become a beautiful company and is extremely competitive and leading the way.
Now, if you could describe for our listeners some of the other companies that you talk about in your book that are in that direction or have actually had a mission as they started to move in the direction of beyond sustainability but doing the right thing.
Well, I like to focus now really on small food enterprises. That's really what we're doing here with Flow Money. So you're talking about, let's say, I'll just pick something that a lot of listeners may know, Stonyfield Farm Yogurt, which I would say, if we want to oversimplify here, we're talking about supporting everything from Stonyfield Farm down, and I'm talking about from sort of revenues and economics, speak. So all the way down to Stonyfield now being, I'm not sure, maybe a $400 million plus, the largest organic yogurt maker in the world, all the way down to, at the other end of the continuum, a company, one of my favorites, called Butterworks Farm, which is a $1 million yogurt maker in northern Vermont, which is one farm family, one farm, one herd. It's the most sustainable, operation I've ever seen, and they make $1 million a year with the yogurt, which is all they can make with their herd, their feed, etc. and it's a beautiful product. So it's that continuum. It's from the individual farm producer up to, let's say, significant, organic food manufacturers. But we're really focused down at the bottom, towards the lower end of that continuum. We really want to connect, going back to our idea before of relationships. We want to connect investors to small food enterprises near where they live, and get that connection to be meaningful from an economic standpoint. So not just people using their consumer dollars to support the enterprises, but actually putting some of their investment capital to work. Because if we're going to turn the tide, which is a big if, but if we are going to, in the food system, we are going to have to steer billions of dollars into new organic farms and regional processing facilities and regional distribution over the next generation. That whole system has been, basically gutted or decimated over the last 75 years. It's going to take a lot of capital to rebuild it, and the only place that capital is going to come from in a meaningful way are the individual investors who live in those regions, live in each region.
Mm-hmm. Amazing stuff. Now, if you can, describe what slow money is for our listeners.
Well, shouldn't we have started with that? Slow money is two things, is the way I describe it. The first is a big discussion. And that sounds kind of goofy when I say it that way, but to me, there is nothing more important at this point in time in our history, and I say our meaning not just America, but Homo sapiens, if we can be that grandiose for a second. There's nothing more important than trying to reestablish a healthier, more sane, more balanced relationship with money. And our money is zooming around the planet in this old model, which is no such thing as money that's too fast or companies that are too big or economic growth that's overheated. That doesn't exist in traditional economics. But now we know that these things all do have limits, even though we don't know what to do about it. So that discussion is really important, and awakening in people the idea that it's possible to do something radically different with your money. That's where you start. Now, that's a big thing, and that's never ending. But that is an important part of what we're doing at Slow Money. We're actually fomenting that discussion with real people in real communities, face-to-face, et cetera. And then, way more specifically, we're creating networks and putting people together to actually start investing in small food enterprises. So that's what we're doing on the ground, and we've been at it for a couple of years. We have 13,000 people have signed what we call the Slow Money Principles. So I'd love it if listeners would go to slowmoney.org and check them out. That's the idea part. That's like, we believe these values are important. And then we are actually starting to use those values to invest. So we've put on 5 regional events, 2 national events. At our last national gathering in Vermont, 600 people came, and over $4 million has been invested in a dozen of the small food enterprises that presented there. So this is an actual investment network through which money is starting to flow, and longer term, we're going to seek to create some new structures that will help money flow through even more catalytically. And the one we're very excited about right now is called the Soil Trust. We're talking to some major foundations right now about providing seed capital to that, and the idea would be, without getting into the weeds on it, the idea would be that we could use some of our capital to provide guarantees, so we can come to these local communities and say, okay, you guys all want to start doing this kind of investing, but it's new and everyone's a little bit scared, which is natural because it's a new thing. How about if we put X number of dollars of guarantees on the table to reduce the risk? And it's clear to me that could be extremely catalytic. A lot of people are inching towards this. There's a lot more interest than people are willing to pull the trigger at the beginning, and so if we can provide some guarantees, I think it would be tremendously catalytic.
Now, do you find yourself meeting up with any resistance from companies who are doing the unsustainable thing?
That's the old, what's the old Gandhi thing of first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win? So something like that. I don't know if I got that right or not, but I don't think anyone's really noticed this. I think everyone's ignoring it still.
Right.
We're small. Also, I think the approach we're taking is this isn't really primarily an advocacy thing. I mean, we're not going out and advocating against Company X or... Right.
No, you're just simply going in the right direction and just kind of letting them decide what they want to do.
Right, that's not a strategic decision. That's just like a personal integrity thing, or it just comes out of my life experience. I'd much rather just invest in an entrepreneur who's trying to do something good than spend my life, lobbying a politician or arguing publicly against something else. I am glad people are taking those advocacy positions. But for me, I think the need right now is just for us to start building what needs to be built and let everything else kind of, take care of itself.
And to give an example on that too, we had recently reviewed the book The One Straw Revolution. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess you should be.
Yeah.
And it's really amazing to find out, here was this Japanese, actually he was a technical researcher, I guess, in agriculture. And, as you know, he had left the field because he'd realized nature as itself was perfect and began doing permaculture farming and actually replenishing the soil. And I thought, what he's doing here is so encouraging, and if people could realize the simplicity of what he was doing, even though it does take a little bit of work, that I think if each one of us, as you say, start taking that small step, it turns into a very large leap.
Yeah, that's an amazingly inspirational story. And I guess what I take away from that is that, again, it's our cleverness isn't always so great. That's a mild way of putting it, right? So, we solve one problem and we maybe create another one that's even worse, or something like that. So the more we can get back in sync with some basic rhythms and basic awarenesses, the better off we're going to be long term, and not think we're going to invent our way out or come up with some new technology or some new miracle, fertilizer that's going to somehow replace actual soil fertility forever. That's my own belief is that's never going to happen. That we've had enough of that, and now we're starting to learn, and we have to go back in the other direction. So it is very simple. Your point is what he did was in a way very simple. He stopped doing a lot of things to allow nature to take its course. Unfortunately, when it comes to investing, the simplest thing, we've been called a revolution. This is the crazy thing. People have called it the slow money revolution. Various journalists, and I always ask myself and others, how could this be a revolution? We're just saying take 1% of your money and start investing in the local food businesses. Why is that revolutionary? And the answer is because our culture and our financial markets have become so complicated and so abstract that the simplest thing, the most common sense thing, seems revolutionary. And that's just the world we're living in.
Exactly. Yeah, make something complicated so somebody doesn't understand it enough to know that they want it.
Yeah.
The book is Slow Money. Our guest today is Woody Tasch. If there's a website people can find out more about your work,
slowmoney.org.
Sounds simple enough. Woody Tasch, thanks for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. We also encourage you, the listeners, to go out and visit us at our website, which is beyond50radio.com. That's, the number 50. Sign up for a free weekly e-newsletter. Also visit us at our blog where we archive our shows so you can enjoy them at your time and share them with others as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.